It was a warm summer evening when I decided to take a road trip to visit my old high school friends, Ryan and Jake, who were now studying at the University of California in Berkeley. Every year, I made it a point to visit them, but this time, I chose to drive instead of flying. The idea was to make the journey part of the adventure, exploring parks, museums, and historical sites along the way. Little did I know, this decision would lead to one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. The first 2 days of the trip were uneventful. I drove through scenic routes, stopped at quaint little towns, and even managed to visit a couple of museums I had always wanted to see. By the third day, I was eager to reach Berkeley and catch up with my friends. However, as the sun set and the sky turned a deep shade of orange, I found myself still on the road, hours away from my destination. It was around 9:30 p.m. when I pulled into a small rest stop. The place was eerily quiet, with no other cars in sight. The rest stop was nothing more than a small building, with a row of parking spaces in front. I parked my car, stretched my legs, and walked toward the building, eager to use the bathroom and grab a cup of coffee to keep me awake for the rest of the drive. As I entered the building, I noticed how dimly lit it was. The hallway led to a men's restroom on one side and a women's restroom on the other. There were a couple of vending machines and a rack of old magazines, but otherwise, the place felt abandoned. I used the restroom quickly, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. When I stepped out, I noticed a car had pulled into the rest stop and parked right next to mine. This struck me as odd. Why would someone park so close when there were plenty of other spaces available? I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a coincidence. I walked over to the vending machine, bought a Red Bull, and took a sip, trying to calm my nerves. But as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The car's engine was still running, and I could see the shadow of the driver inside. My heart began to race as I debated whether to leave immediately or finish my drink. Before I could make a decision, the car's engine turned off, and the driver's door opened. A tall man with a beard stepped out, wearing a brown leather jacket. He had both hands in his pockets, and his eyes were fixed on me. I felt a chill run down my spine as he started walking toward me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. "Hey," he called out, his voice low and menacing. I nodded in response, trying to appear calm, but my heart was pounding in my chest. As we passed each other, I quickened my pace, eager to get back to my car. But before I could reach it, he called out again. "Hey, wait up," he said, his voice louder this time. I turned around, and that's when I saw it. A 9mm pistol pointed directly at my face. My breath caught in my throat as I raised my hands in surrender. "Give me your watch, wallet, and phone," he demanded, his voice cold and steady. I obeyed without hesitation, handing over everything he asked for. But instead of letting me go, he motioned for me to follow him. My heart sank as he led me toward the woods behind the rest stop. I knew then that this wasn't just a robbery. He had something far more sinister in mind. I begged him to let me go, offering him my car, my money, anything he wanted. But he remained silent, his grip on the gun never wavering. We walked deeper into the woods, the darkness closing in around us. My mind raced with thoughts of my family, my friends, and all the things I had yet to do in life. I couldn't believe this was how it would end. In the middle of nowhere, at the hands of a stranger. Finally, he stopped and ordered me to kneel. I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable. 3 shots rang out, and I screamed, falling to the ground in terror. But as I lay there, I realized something. I wasn't hurt. The man was laughing, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the trees. "Go home, kid," he said, still laughing, "and don't forget to wash your pants." I watched as he walked away, disappearing into the night. My body trembled as I got to my feet, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I stumbled back to my car, my legs shaking with every step. When I reached the rest stop, I went inside to wash my face. My reflection in the mirror was a mess. My face was red and swollen, my eyes bloodshot. I couldn't believe I had survived. I drove to the nearest town and called the police, but they never found the man. To this day, I have no idea who he was or what he wanted. All I know is that I'll never stop at a rest stop again. Dan had been a truck driver for over 25 years, and he thought he had seen it all. But one stormy night, he encountered something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was a rainy evening, and Dan was driving his truck on a deserted highway. He was 4 hours away from his destination, where he was supposed to deliver a shipment of industrial supplies. The rain was coming down in sheets, making visibility nearly impossible. But Dan was a seasoned driver, and he knew how to handle tough conditions. As he drove, a strange feeling began to creep over him. It was a sense of unease, as if something wasn't right. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just the weather and the long hours on the road. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with every mile. To distract himself, Dan turned on the radio. The music helped a little, but the eerie silence of the highway was still unsettling. He slowed down, taking extra care to navigate the slippery road. Suddenly, through the thick fog, Dan saw the headlights of a car coming straight toward him. It was in the wrong lane, speeding directly at his truck. Dan's heart leaped into his throat as he swerved to avoid a collision. But the road was too wet, and his truck skidded out of control. The last thing Dan remembered was the sound of metal crunching and the sensation of his truck flipping over. When he regained consciousness, he was lying on the cold, wet ground. His body was in excruciating pain, and he couldn't move his legs. Dan tried to call for help, but his voice was weak. He was trapped in the wreckage of his truck, alone and injured. As he lay there, he began to hear footsteps approaching. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but then he saw two figures emerging from the fog. It was an older man and his son. They had been driving behind Dan and had witnessed the accident. They rushed to his side, calling for an ambulance and trying to keep him conscious. Dan was grateful for their help, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. When the ambulance arrived, Dan was rushed to the hospital. The doctors told him he had several broken bones, internal bleeding, and a severe head injury. They said he was lucky to be alive. Dan spent weeks in the hospital, recovering from his injuries. But even as his body healed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. At first, he thought it was just the trauma of the accident. But then, he began to see a shadowy figure at the foot of his bed. The figure was tall and dark, with no discernible features. It would appear at random times, day or night, and just stand there, staring at Dan. He tried to tell the nurses, but they dismissed it as a side effect of his head injury. Dan, however, was convinced the figure was real. He began researching the stretch of highway where the accident had occurred and discovered that it was notorious for similar incidents. Many drivers had reported seeing a ghostly figure or a car coming at them in the wrong lane, only to vanish at the last second. One night, the figure appeared again, but this time, it spoke. It told Dan that it was the spirit of a truck driver who had died in an accident on that same stretch of road decades ago. The driver had been killed by a drunk driver who was going the wrong way, and his spirit had been trapped there ever since. Dan was horrified, but also relieved to finally have an explanation. He began to pray for the spirit, hoping it would find peace. Over time, the figure stopped appearing, and Dan was able to move on with his life. But he never forgot that night on the highway. To this day, he avoids driving on that stretch of road, and he always says a prayer for the lost souls who still haunt it. Mike had been driving trucks for over 2 decades, and he prided himself on being a cautious and reliable driver. But one fateful night, his life took a terrifying turn, all because he decided to help a stranger. It was a quiet evening in southern Missouri, and Mike was hauling a load of steel sheets to a construction site. The route took him through the Mark Twain National Forest, a beautiful but desolate area, especially at night. Mike was making good time and planned to stop at a truck stop near Springfield to rest and grab a bite to eat. As he drove, he noticed an old beat-up truck parked on the side of the road with its hood up. A man was standing next to it, waving his arms frantically. Mike slowed down and pulled over a little ahead of the stranded vehicle. As a truck driver, he believed in the unspoken code of helping fellow drivers in need. The man, who introduced himself as Neil, looked to be in his mid-40s. He was wearing a grease-stained flannel shirt and had a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Neil explained that his truck had broken down due to a damaged alternator, and he had been stranded for hours. He asked Mike if he could give him a ride to the nearest town. Mike hesitated for a moment, sizing Neil up. The man seemed harmless enough, and Mike couldn't bring himself to leave him stranded in the middle of nowhere. Reluctantly, he agreed to help. Neil grabbed his bag and climbed into the passenger seat of Mike's truck. As they drove, Neil proved to be quite chatty. He told Mike he was from Alabama and was on his way to pick up a load in St. Louis. He also mentioned that his truck had been giving him trouble for weeks, but he had hoped it would last a little longer. Mike listened politely, but something about Neil's nervous demeanor made him uneasy. About 20 minutes into the drive, Mike noticed 2 cars in his rearview mirror. They were following closely, one behind the other. At first, he didn't think much of it, assuming they were just impatient drivers trying to overtake him. But as the miles passed, the cars stayed behind him, never attempting to pass. Mike's unease grew. He asked Neil if he knew the drivers, but Neil shook his head, his face pale. "Never seen them before," he said, his voice trembling. Mike tried to lighten the mood with a joke, asking if Neil was running from someone. Neil laughed nervously, but his hands were shaking. The cars followed them for about 10 miles, and Mike's anxiety reached its peak. He kept glancing at the rearview mirror, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Finally, the cars made their move. They accelerated, passing Mike's truck and then swerving to block the road. Mike slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. 3 men got out of the cars, all armed with guns. They approached Mike's truck, their faces grim. One of them, who seemed to be the leader, ordered Mike and Neil to get out of the truck. Mike raised his hands in surrender, trying to stay calm. "We don't want any trouble," Mike said, his voice steady, despite the fear coursing through him. "Take whatever you want, just let us go." But the leader wasn't interested in negotiation. He repeated his command, this time more aggressively. Mike and Neil slowly got out of the truck, their hands in the air. The men patted them down, taking their wallets, phones, and keys. Mike thought they would take the truck and leave, but the leader had other plans. He threw the keys back to Mike and ordered him to start the engine. Confused and terrified, Mike obeyed. The leader then gestured for Neil to get into one of the cars. Mike's mind raced as he tried to figure out what was happening. Were they being kidnapped? Was this some kind of setup? He glanced at Neil, who looked like he was on the verge of passing out. The cars led Mike's truck down a narrow dirt road, deeper into the forest. The trees closed in around them, and Mike's sense of dread grew with every passing minute. He knew they were heading into a trap, but he had no way out. Finally, they stopped in a small clearing. The men ordered Mike and Neil out of the vehicles and forced them to walk into the woods. Mike's heart pounded as they approached an old abandoned cabin. The men pushed them inside and tied their hands and feet. "Don't go anywhere," one of the men said with a cruel laugh before leaving the cabin. Mike and Neil sat in silence, their minds racing. Mike knew they had to escape, but the ropes were tight and the cabin was dark and damp. He struggled to free himself, his wrists burning from the effort. After what felt like an eternity, Mike managed to loosen the ropes enough to free his hands. He quickly untied Neil, and they stumbled out of the cabin, their legs shaky from fear and exhaustion. They ran through the woods, their breath coming in ragged gasps. When they finally reached the road, they flagged down a passing driver, who took them to the nearest town. The police were called, and Mike and Neil gave their statements, describing the men and the events of that night. The police searched the area but found no trace of the attackers. Mike never found out who they were or what they wanted. All he knew was that he had come dangerously close to losing his life that night. To this day, Mike avoids driving through that part of Missouri. The experience left him shaken, but it also made him more cautious. He still helps fellow drivers in need, but he's always on guard, ready for the unexpected. Carlos Martinez had always been a creature of habit. For 6 months, he worked night shifts at the Sierra Vista Ranch, a sprawling property in rural Arizona that had been converted into a boutique hotel. The job was simple: managing guest check-ins, handling minor emergencies, and ensuring the property stayed secure. But the real challenge was the drive home. Every night, after his 12-hour shift, Carlos faced a 90-minute commute through desolate highways, flanked by scrubland and skeletal cacti. The isolation was suffocating, but he'd found a small comfort: a taco truck parked outside an RV park halfway through his journey. The truck was unremarkable: a faded blue vehicle with El Sabroso Tacos hand-painted in peeling yellow letters. Its owner, a middle-aged man with a salt and pepper beard and a permanent smile, had become a fixture in Carlos's life. They never exchanged names, but their nightly interactions followed a script. "Tres tacos de carnitas, por favor," Carlos would say, and the man would nod, his hands moving swiftly as he grilled meat, chopped onions, and drizzled salsa verde. The tacos were sublime, crispy, savory, and just spicy enough to jolt Carlos awake for the remaining drive. It was a sweltering July night when Carlos first sensed something wrong. The desert heat clung to him like a second skin as he stepped out of his car at the RV park. The taco truck's lights were on, but the usual hum of activity was absent. No clatter of utensils, no sizzle of meat, no radio playing rancheras. The silence felt heavy, unnatural. "Hola, estás aquí?" Carlos called out, peering through the truck's service window. The grill was lit, but no one stood behind it. A pot of beans bubbled ominously, threatening to boil over. The cash register hung open, its drawer yanked out and tossed onto the counter, coins spilling onto the floor. Carlos's stomach tightened. This isn't right, he thought. He circled the truck, his boots crunching on gravel. The RV park was eerily still, no generators humming, no TVs blaring. Even the cicadas had gone quiet. Carlos hesitated, then climbed the metal steps to the truck's side entrance. The door creaked open, releasing a wave of smoke and the acrid stench of burning flesh. Inside, the truck was a disaster. Tortillas and lettuce littered the floor, and the salsa containers had been knocked over, their contents pooling like blood. Carlos's eyes watered as he stumbled toward the grill, where a thick black smoke curled upward. He reached for the knob to turn it off, and froze. There, seared into the metal grates, was the imprint of a human hand. The fingers were splayed, the palm pressed flat, as if someone had tried to claw their way out of the flames. The skin was charred to a crisp, the edges curling like burnt paper. Carlos gagged, his mind racing. Whose hand is this? Where's the owner? He staggered backward, tripping over a stack of napkins. His elbow hit the deep fryer, sending a spray of scalding oil across his arm. Cursing, he scrambled out of the truck and collapsed on the ground, hyperventilating. The image of the hand haunted him, its desperation, its agony. Carlos fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling so violently he nearly dropped it. The 911 operator's voice was calm, but Carlos's words tumbled out in a panicked slurry. There's a hand on the grill. The taco guy. He's gone. The register's empty. I think someone robbed him, or worse. Sir, are you in danger right now? The operator asked. I don't know. I'm alone, but Dios mío, what if they're still here? Carlos's eyes darted around the RV park. Shadows stretched long under the flickering streetlight, and every rustle of wind through the mesquite trees sounded like footsteps. Stay on the line. Officers are en route. The first patrol car arrived 20 minutes later. Two officers, their faces etched with skepticism, questioned Carlos as he paced the parking lot. You're sure it wasn't just, I don't know, a prank? Officer Jenkins asked, shining his flashlight into the truck. Carlos glared. You think I'd mistake a real human hand for a joke? Inside the truck, the officers photographed the scene, bagged the cash register as evidence, and scraped samples from the grill. The forensic tech, a young woman in a hazmat suit, frowned at the handprint. This wasn't an accident. Someone held him down. Carlos's blood ran cold. For weeks, Carlos replayed the night in his mind. He'd never asked the owner's name, never learned a single detail about his life. Was he married? Did he have kids? The guilt gnawed at him. He began avoiding the RV park, taking longer routes home just to bypass it. But the desert roads played tricks on him. Once, he swore he saw the blue taco truck in his rearview mirror, its headlights blazing. When he turned to look, it vanished. Sleep became a battleground. Night after night, Carlos dreamed of the handprint, reaching for him, gripping his wrist, dragging him into the flames. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, the smell of burnt flesh lingering in his nostrils. The police closed the case after 2 months, citing lack of evidence. No body was ever found, and the owner's identity remained a mystery. The truck was impounded, its grill dismantled for forensic analysis. Carlos tried to move on, but the questions haunted him. Was the owner murdered? Did he owe money to the wrong people? Or was this a random act of violence? One afternoon, Carlos drove to the impound lot, determined to find answers. The truck sat in a corner, its blue paint bleached by the sun. Inside, the grill had been removed, leaving a gaping hole. Carlos sifted through the debris, a stained apron, a half-empty bottle of hot sauce, a Polaroid photo stuck to the wall. The photo showed the owner laughing, arm in arm with a young boy. On the back, scribbled in Spanish, "Para mi hijo Luis, te quiero mucho." For my son Luis, I love you so much. Carlos pocketed the photo, vowing to find Luis, but his search led nowhere. Social media, local newspapers, even visits to nearby towns, all dead ends. It was as if the owner had never existed. A year later, Carlos quit his job at the ranch. On his final drive home, he stopped at the RV park one last time. The spot where the taco truck once stood was empty, marked only by a stain of motor oil. As he turned to leave, a figure emerged from the shadows, a teenage boy with the owner's eyes. "Eres Carlos?" the boy asked, clutching a folded note. Carlos nodded, his throat dry. "Mi papá. He left this for you." The note read, "Gracias por ser mi cliente favorito. Cuídese. Thank you for being my favorite customer. Take care." Before Carlos could ask questions, the boy disappeared into the night. To this day, Carlos doesn't know if the owner survived or if the note was a cruel hoax. But he keeps the Polaroid on his desk, a reminder of the man who added flavor to his loneliest hours. And though he never eats at food trucks anymore, he sometimes parks near one just to watch the steam rise from the grills and wonder. Emily Carter had always prided herself on her independence. At 22, she was a college senior with a love for adventure, and her impromptu road trip through the Midwest was supposed to be a celebration of her final summer before adulthood. She'd planned to visit landmarks she'd only seen in photos, the Badlands, Mount Rushmore, and the Corn Palace. But what began as a journey of freedom turned into a nightmare she'd never forget. It was June 2018, and Emily had been driving for nearly 12 hours. The sun had long since set, leaving the highway shrouded in inky darkness. Her phone's GPS estimated she'd reach her Airbnb by 2 a.m., but fatigue clawed at her eyelids. She'd already chugged 2 energy drinks, but the caffeine buzz had faded, replaced by a hollow exhaustion. Just a little longer, she told herself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. But as her vision blurred and the lane markers began to dance, she knew she had to stop. The rest stop appeared like a mirage, a dimly lit building nestled between stretches of Nebraska prairie. Emily pulled into the empty parking lot, relieved to see the open 24 hours sign flickering above the door. The place was eerily quiet, save for the hum of a malfunctioning streetlight. She grabbed her purse and hurried inside, the automatic doors wheezing shut behind her. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow over the cracked tile floors. The restrooms were down a narrow hallway, their doors marked with faded signs. Emily chose the women's restroom, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The restroom was freezing, the air thick with the scent of industrial cleaner. Emily entered the farthest stall, locking the flimsy door behind her. She'd barely settled when she heard the main door creak open. Heavy footsteps shuffled in, followed by labored breathing. Probably another traveler, she reasoned, though her pulse quickened. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on her stall door. "Occupied," Emily called out, forcing a laugh to mask her unease. Silence. Then, an eye, bloodshot and unblinking, appeared in the crack between the door and its frame. Emily screamed, scrambling backward. The man outside began slamming his forehead against the door, his laughter guttural and unhinged. Bang, bang, bang. The metal hinges groaned, and the lock rattled. "Leave me alone," Emily shrieked, bracing her body against the door. The assault stopped abruptly. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, the man whispered, "I see you." Adrenaline surged through Emily's veins. She waited until his footsteps retreated before bolting out of the stall. The restroom was empty, but the main door swung lazily on its hinges. She sprinted toward the exit, her sneakers slipping on the wet floor. Outside, the parking lot was still deserted, except for her car and him. The man stood beside her Honda Civic, his face hidden in shadow. He was tall, with hunched shoulders and arms that hung limply at his sides. As Emily fumbled for her keys, he began lurching toward her, his movements jerky and unnatural. She dove into the driver's seat, slamming the door just as he collided with it. His palms slapped against the window, leaving greasy smears. Emily turned the key, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. "Please, please, please," she begged the engine. The car roared to life. Emily reversed so fast, the tires screeched, then sped onto the highway. In her rearview mirror, the man stood motionless, watching her flee. Emily didn't stop driving until she reached a brightly lit gas station, 30 miles away. She called the police, but by the time officers arrived at the rest stop, the man was gone. No security cameras, no fingerprints, just a cracked stall door and the lingering stench of madness. For months, Emily jumped at every knock, every flicker of movement in her periphery. She quit her part-time job as a night shift waitress, too terrified to be alone after dark. Therapy helped, but some wounds never fully heal. Years later, Emily still wonders, who was that man? Was he a transient, a psychopath, or something less human? Why did he target her? She avoids rest stops now, opting to hold her bladder for hours rather than risk a repeat encounter. But sometimes, on long drives, she'll catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure in her rearview mirror. And for a heartbeat, she's back in that stall, staring into a bloodshot eye.